Today we're doing another oral history interview for the archives at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. Today is October 26, 2006. I'm Charles Lundquist, and our interviewee today is Ray Hembree. Ray, it's good to have you here today.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
Will you start out by telling us a little bit about where you spent your youth, where you were educated, and how you got into the space program?
I was born in a small town called Ackworth, Georgia. It's northeast of Atlanta. And my dad was a farmer, and he wanted to work in a full-time job, so we moved to Birmingham when I was 3 years old. This was in 1926. And he went to work in the steel industry in Birmingham. I grew up in Birmingham. I went to grade school called Fairmont, just outside the city limits, northern city limits of Birmingham. And one of the greatest things about living there was the park that the WPA built during the early administration of FDR. And it had a nice swimming pool, had ball fields, and tennis courts. And I spent many a happy time there. I went to high school called Jefferson County High School. We had to ride the bus starting in the 7th grade through the 12th to the school in Tarrant City, about 6 or 8 miles away. And so we rode the bus each day. We had some excellent teachers. I think we had some very dedicated teachers. I should have listened to the teachers more than I did, and if I had, one of my homeroom teachers ended up teaching at University of Alabama as an instructor in mathematics. She was that good. But I wouldn't take her subjects. I was in their homeroom, but I wouldn't take the subjects. My dad told me it was not possible to go to college, no money. I wanted to go, but it didn't work. I did start carrying newspapers when I was 12 years old through 15, and that gave me spending money. At 16, I went to work on Saturdays and Friday afternoons in a large feed and grocery store in downtown Birmingham. In fact, it's near the railroad tracks that go through Birmingham between 1st Avenue and 2nd Avenue. This also gave me opportunity to make a little bit of money. Not much, but it was an income. When I graduated from high school, one of my instructors, who was secretary to the principal, had me 5 places to go for an interview for a job. First one, they wanted it was a barber supply company, and I was not interested in that, of course. And another one was selling paper. I said no thanks. And then I interviewed for the main office at U.S. Steel, located in a 16-story building downtown Birmingham. And this was 12th floor, was completely covered with one group of 75 people. Now this was open except for the 3 offices for the wheels there, and they wouldn't let women work there because they did have 2 old maids that were left over from World War I, and they were the only women out of the 75, and everybody in that department had started the same job, mail clerk, file clerk. And I did this they said take a letter, and I'd taken shorthand in high school and had taken typing. And so I took a letter, and then I had to type it up, and I handed it to him and said, "Can you go to work Thursday?" And he said, "Yes, sir." Well, unfortunately, our school didn't have yearbooks at that time. This is during the Depression, or right after. And all they did was have a get-together of a picnic on a Friday. Well, the Friday I was working. I went to work that day. And I promised my girlfriend, who later became my wife, that we would have our own picnic later. So we did. Well, I worked there for 2 years. The first, they take the mail around every morning, and we had rooms full of files, and when people wanted to file, they wanted it now. So you got it to them. There was no air conditioning, and you wore a white shirt. They didn't make any other kind. They were long sleeve, and you had a jacket on and a tie. And if you went out of the office, you put that jacket back on as you walked out of the office. It was entirely different than our Fridays that we have today, where people wear jeans in the bank and other places. But it was a good working relationship. I would bring the mail around, and I learned as a paper boy to call people by their name. So this man had about 6 or 8 people in his group, and I'd go, "Good morning, Mr. Johnston," and I never got anything, not even eye contact, other than One day, after I'd been working there 2 months, I said, "Good morning, Mr. Johnston," and he says, "Hey, boy, can you type?" I said, "Yes, sir. Show me." So I put my mail down and sat down, and I typed something for him, handed it to him. He said, "You sit still." So I ended up working there as a clerk, which was quite a promotion. The company didn't pay a lot of money. They were very paternalistic. They started us out at $58 a month. And it didn't last a month. Don't tell me how long it lasted in 1941, because it didn't last a month. I borrowed money every month to get by the first 2 months. Well, then they gave me a promotion when I started this new job, and they gave me back pay from the beginning.
Oh, how nice.
And then after 7 or 8 months, I got another raise, and they paid me, again, back pay for that. So I went down and paid down on a diamond ring for my wife. Future wife, of course. Well, the war heated up, as you know, in the 40s. By 1942, things were getting very hot, and I knew I'd have to go into service. So I wanted to go in the Navy, and I wanted to fly. I took a few flying lessons, but I couldn't afford the $60 an hour for flying lessons, so I didn't have but a few hours when I went down and took the test to go into the Navy. When they finally lowered it to first you had to have 4 years of college to get in the Navy Aviation. They dropped it to 2 years, and finally they dropped college requirement altogether if you could pass the mental and physical. So I went to Atlanta and took 3 days of testing, physical and mentals, and got in, except the friend that went with me, he got in and I didn't. They told me to come back as soon as I gained 10 pounds. And all I had to do was hold up my hand and I'm in. Well, I went home. I weighed exactly what I did when I graduated from high school, 120 pounds, and I'm 6'2". And they said they couldn't take me. I'd have to gain 10 pounds. I ate 6 meals a day. I ate bananas for the dozen. 2 weeks later, I went back, and I weighed 131 pounds. So I went into the Naval Cadet program. They didn't call me until June. And
What year was that?
1942.
43.
I went in.
43,
I
all right.
joined in December 42, and they called me and we went for 4 months at the University of South Carolina to pre-flight, because most of us had not been to college. A few had. Well, I had a roommate that had 2 years of college. And after we finished there, a few of us went to Austin Peay State College in Tennessee. So we were flying. Unfortunately, we were flying side by side aircraft, and my instructor was a very burly man, and he took up a lot more of the seat than I did, my part of his seat too. Plus, he had alcohol reeking on his breath every time I was in the plane with him, which I didn't like that either. No. But anyway, I had enough instructions earlier that I got into trouble real quick by overshooting the landing, and I slipped it in across the controls and slipped it in, made a perfect landing. And he bawled me out for 15 minutes and cursing and everything, because I wasn't supposed to know how to do that. Well, anyway, after a month, I was supposed to solo the next day. They called a bunch of us in and told us we're going to boot camp. They'd sent a piece of paper around while we were in South Carolina, at the University of South Carolina, saying I desired to return to civilian life immediately, or I desired to stay in the Navy in the event that my cadet training is discontinued for any reason. Well, I signed the one to stay in. So here I am in it, and I don't like the Navy anymore. I'm in boot camp. It was a sad experience in some respects. In other respects, I guess it was good for us.
You were married by then?
No, yes. No, I was. You could not be married and be in the program.
All right.
I didn't. They interviewed us after we finished our boot camp, and we were. They said they wanted to send me to B-12 program, which meant I'd go to college full time. And I said I'd rather not. And they tried every way they could to talk me into it, and I shot myself in the foot and said, no thanks. You cut the ground out from under me once, I was afraid the Navy would do it again. I was very unhappy with the Navy at this point in time. And the interviewer got a little bit aggravated at me, and he said, and I could tell he was getting angry at me, and I got up to leave the table, and he said, what's your hobby? And I said, photography, and I went on my way. And the next week, they listed where we would go after that. Many of the people were going to Banana River, which now is the space port down there. Yeah. But at that time, it was really the worst thing I guess you could do in the Navy, because you were going to drive these landing craft for the Marines out in the South Pacific fighting the Japanese. And you were fired on all the way in and hope you made it in. And I saw grown men cry that were sent there. And mine said photography school, Pensacola, 5 months. And I started, maybe it looked a little better in my opinion from then on. And while there, I've been there a couple of months, and I finally went home, AWOL, but I didn't tell anybody except my buddy who stole the muster papers for me. I got kicked out of the Navy. I had to get home and make up with my girlfriend, my fiancée. And we made arrangements to get married on my birthday of March the 5th. My mother and dad were married on March 5th, and I was born March 5th a year later. And I thought it'd be nice to get married on my birthday. And my buddy and I were playing ping pong in the USO downtown Pensacola one night. And we walked out on the sidewalk, and I just stepped on the sidewalk. The shore patrolman grabbed me, restricted the base for 2 weeks. So we had to put off our wedding till March the 25th. And we were married there, and that was 62 years ago now. And I still have the same wife. And from there, then I was sent to Polaroid Corporation for a month. No, before that, I was sent to Washington, D.C. to printing school. Printing and photo labs were tied pretty closely together.
Right.
Usually were adjacent to each other because they had to work hand in hand. And after that, I went to to Polaroid Corporation for a month's training, special training. And then from there to Norfolk, Virginia, and it's going to ship out. It's going to be 10 planes. We're going to fly out and photograph Mexico. Now, don't ask me why we were photographing Mexico, but we were aerial photographers to take pictures of Mexico.
All right.
Well, another friend and I were left standing on the docks. There's 10 planes. They land on water and they land on land. Going to get overseas pay, going to get flight pay, and you were going to land in the United States every 2 weeks to refurbish and process the film. Greatest situation you could imagine. Well, we were left standing there. nobody got sick, nobody went over the hill, nobody died, and there we were. So we reported back in, and they sent us 2 weeks special training to Naval Photographic Center in Washington, D.C. And we learned how to operate and processing machines where we're going to be put on an aircraft carrier. And these were processing motion picture film. So we did that for 2 weeks, and then our orders were changed. They were going to send us to Kern, California. Well, my friend was from Los Angeles, and he'd never heard of Kern. Inyo is a one county, and Kern's another county, and then where they're adjacent, the little town is called Kern, just a little crossroads, east of the High Sierras, about 15 miles maybe. And then, but in the meantime, in the year before, it started the California Institute of Technology people had located a place for the Navy to do aviation ordnance testing. And they chose China Lake right in the middle of the Mojave Desert, over 1,000 square mile Navy base called China Lake. And you call it China Lake because when it rains and the sun gets on it, it bakes it, and you land B-25s and other aircraft on it. And it's about 50 miles further in than where they land the shuttle.
Edwards.
At Edwards.
Yeah.
It's about 50 miles up toward Mount Whitney. In fact, we could look out and see Mount Whitney from the base.
So you ended up there then for a while.
Ended up there. And I worked as a photographer. We did everything you could name. In those days, we didn't have specialties. And I've taken the parties. I've taken Admiral's glass and put it down where he's drinking, take his picture, get back to him, and you get by with that. Photography get by with a lot of things. And I stayed there, and finally they had enough housing that they would let women work there and help. You had to live on base. There was no other place to live. The little town outside looked like a set you would see in an old movie. And at boardwalks, it was either muddy or sand. And a lot of people were still walking around with 6-shooters on their hips in this little town, very small town. And this photo lab was an interesting place to work, of course. We had I had a cinematographer from I can't remember his name now, Vincent Hope, from Hollywood. He was very famous then already, but we seldom ever saw him. He was the chief of the lab. And his deputy was a college professor. He really wasn't a military man, but they put him in uniform. He was a senior lieutenant, one of the nicest people you could want to meet. And then there was a chief warrant officer who was the straw boss who ran the show. I mean, he's the one that...
So you got a lot of very practical photographic experience and background.
Imagine. And I worked there, and I didn't dare tell anybody I'd been to photographic school, because I saw what happened to a young man that came in and said he'd been to photographic school. Well, many of these people they'd learned their trade by apprenticeship. Yeah. And they'd given the right arm to have gone to photographic school. So I just kept quiet, laid low. And as I walked in the door, there was a second-class guy called Tex Matthews. And he put his arm around my shoulder. "Oh, we're so happy to see you. You're glad to hear." Well, I found out why he was glad to see me. I was doing his job, mine too. The next day on, he was running a crap game in one of the dark rooms.
Okay, well, how did all this come to an end?
Well, I stayed there for I did my work. I got to fly. I got all the flying I wanted. I got flight pay and got promoted, and I ended up as first class photographer's mate. And when I was getting ready to get out of the Navy, which I knew would be January of '46, and my wife, I got her there too, by the way. That was really the high point, getting her there. And she went to work. She lived in the Marine barracks upstairs, They didn't have any Marines, and they had big complex, and they let civilian women, we live upstairs, let civilian men that worked there live downstairs. And so for 3 months, she lived 3 blocks away from me. I lived in a barracks over here, and she's living in a barracks down there. But we would take vacation. We would go to Los Angeles on the river. And it was quite interesting because you could do anything at 3 o'clock in the morning that you could do at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. You could go to a movie, you could go to a theater, we even tried ice skating one time until she fell. That was the only time we ever tried that.
So the war ended, and you got out, I guess.
Well, I was getting out. About 3 weeks before I was to get out, Mr. Love, the senior lieutenant, came to me and he said, "Ray, will you stay in the Navy if we promote you to chief?" And I said, "No, sir." He said, "Why not?" I said, "Well, you've wasted a lot of breath this past year or so if I did, because you told me I had to go to college, and I listened to you. And they passed a GI Bill, now I can go to college." "Well, where are you going to college?" "I don't know." "What are you going to study?" "I don't have any idea." "Well, let me try something else. The powers that be has told me, ask you if you would take the job as chief of this lab as a civilian." I said, "Mr. Love, somebody's crazy. I've never supervised anyone, but please don't tell them I said so. If they're crazy enough to offer me the job, I'll take it." I took the job. I held it for 2 years. I looked around one day, and I had hired all the military to all civilian. I had 35 employees, all civilian, and all of them were older than me, more experienced than me, and I was the youngest, and I'm the boss. Time to go to college. So we headed to Auburn that summer, and from Birmingham to Auburn, it was a long half-day's trip. Narrow roads, dusty, hot, no air conditioning, and they'd never heard of air conditioning at Auburn at that time. And they were overrun by ex-GIs, and it was ho-hum like, "Yeah, come on down and go to school here." And the only place we could find to live, they'd never heard of married people going to college. And they were turning women away because they had to live in the dorms in order to go there, because they didn't have enough dorms for them. So they were building as fast as they could. It was hot and dusty, and after a half day, you're going down and back. And the only place we found to live was out in the country in an outhouse. Now, we'd been living in an air-conditioned apartment all this time on a Navy base, and we were living very well, even if it did cost $24 a month. Dottie could get an apartment. I couldn't, but she could as a civilian, and I could live with her. So we lived pretty much as civilians in that respect. And and so we were headed back. That fall we left, and we were headed to Auburn in 1947. And we drove through Houston, Texas. We'd never been there. And I said, "I read something about this school down here. Let's go out and look at the campus, University of Houston." It was at that time, it was a private school. It's now part of the Texas system. And we went out, and they were just as nice as anybody I've ever seen. "Please come to school here." Well, school had started 2 weeks before, and I wasn't about to start late. I'd been out of high school 7 years, and I was scared to death already. So we went on to Birmingham, where my parents lived. We stayed with them. We hadn't been there for many years, and so as far as spending any time, so we thought, well, we'll just loaf a few. My wife loafed for 1 week, and she went to work downtown. I loafed for 2 weeks, and I went to work in a place nearby. And then in January, we headed back to Houston, and they promised a housing on the campus. And now the housing was not very great, but it was housing, and they looked after married people. The one thing that really sold me on it, they had just built a 5-story library with cubicles on every floor, with a desk and chair and lighting and air conditioning building.
Okay, so you found a school you liked.
A happy home.
All right, good.
And we spent, well, I went straight through for 3 years. I should not have done that. I should have taken 4 years and gone ahead and gotten my master's at that time because I had enough GI Bill to do it. And I was pretty well burned out by the time going summer and winter.
So your degree was in what?
In photography, photographic science, with a minor in physics and math. I had a minor in both. And so when I thought I had a job for 3 months. It was all settled, Pan American Oil Company. I liked Texas. I liked the people. I wanted to stay there, and I liked Houston. Dottie did too. She had a job downtown. She worked daytime, and I worked, and went to school at night. We even shared some of the same instructors, and in English and things like that. And so we were going to stay there. I got a call from the personnel officer, and he said, "When do you think you'll report to duty?" And I said, "Well, next week I should finish up my course of work." And I said, "The following week, give me another week to get out of the housing here and get a place to live, and I'll report the following Monday." And we talked for about 15 minutes, and we'd already said goodbye. And he said, wait, Ray, I need to ask you one more question. I forgot to ask you. What's your military status?" And I had a sinking feeling. I said, "I'm in the inactive Naval Reserve. I did it as a favor for a commander that I knew in the Navy who was commandant of the Naval Reserve and wanted me to take pictures of their functions and wanted me to wear a uniform. And that's the only reason I did." He said, "I'm sorry, the company has a policy they will not hire anybody in any reserve." The Korean War had just started. So, what did I do now? I knew they had a freeze on where I'd been working in California for the Navy, but I took a chance. A buddy of mine that was graduating with me, we were between classes, and I asked him to go with me. We went to California. We left Houston at 5:30 one night and pulled into San Diego 12:30 the next night, and visited his relatives that lived in San Diego, and then we drove up the 200 or 300 miles into the desert. I went directly to Dr. Plum. We called him Grandma to his back because he treated us like we were grandkids, some of us. And I went directly to his office. He was commandant of the Naval Reserve. He came back as a civilian too, and told him I wanted a job and that I heard there was a freeze on. He gave me a big bear hug, and he said, "Well," he said, "are you ready to go to work?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Okay, sit down." I sat down, and he got on the telephone. In a few minutes, he said, "Go to personnel and check in." I asked the lady at personnel, I said, "What would you have told me if I come in?" And she gave me a spiel that she had memorized that she gave everybody that was a freeze on and couldn't do anything. And they'd look at my application when it was off and everything. Well, I went to work, and I came back, and I loaded up what we owned, and we moved to California. Well, to make a long story short, that was one great thing to do, really. I went back to work in the photo lab that I was chief of when I left there, and now I'm just another employee. But that was all right too. I got my foot in the door. And a lady that had been our branch secretary years before, older lady, one day I was walking down the hall and said, "Ray, stand here a minute." And I said, "Why?" She said, "It's a guy coming down the hall here I want to introduce you to. I've been telling you good things about you." He came down the hall, and he was one of the branch chiefs, and his group were all professional people, and I was qualified for it, but they didn't have an opening or anything, and I couldn't get in there. And he said, "They've been telling me good things about you." And I said, "Well, I appreciate that." He said, "How about you come talk to me sometime?" I said, "Okay, when?" He looked at me and he said, "Well, why not right now?" He said, "Okay." So we went to his office, and we managed to work out a deal to get me in his organization temporarily. And I went in there and I worked hard. And I was very fortunate to know people that I'd been in the Navy with, particularly one man. They had a track sled, they called it, 4.1 miles long. And they put J-toes on this sled And they would go down, and as it got further, it would plow down into deeper water in the trough there and throw water 30 feet high. And this was to simulate firing rockets from a jet aircraft before putting them on the jet aircraft. So, and they kept trying to put high-speed cameras on there, and they kept falling apart. I said, aha, I know a guy that was, since he was in high school, had been working for Acme Camera Company. They built the machines that were used in those days for all the extra stuff that you do on computers today.
Yeah.
And I went down to see him in Pasadena, and he was operating a milling machine. Had an apron on, working off on a milling machine. Roy, I prepared a few specs here of a camera, and one of the main ones is it has to operate 50 Gs in any orientation. Can you build me one, a fast one, that will really fast, like put them through in a few seconds? He said, I think so. So I said, well, before you say yes, I said, you come up and view a fireman. He came up, and we stood there and watched the firing. It was gone. He walked around and scratched his neck. That's fast. Man, that was fast. Gee, that was fast. I said, well, you still think you can build Steve? I think so. Let me go back and do a little figuring. So a few weeks later, he called me and said, would you come down? And said, the boss wants to talk with both of us. So we sat there at the table, and the guy says, now, Roy says he can build this camera, and I believe it. And I'm willing for him to do it, but I'm not willing to contract with the military. I don't want you in my hair. I don't want you looking over our shoulder. I don't want to make a contract. I don't want to have anything to do with the military. If he can build it, we'll put it on this shelf right up here, and you come buy it off the shelf. Well, I was delighted. I didn't want to do that anyway. People go through all the paperwork. So I went back and I made a proposal and was able to get $20,000. Now, that was a lot of money in 1951. And I managed to get $20,000. I figured I would get at least an engineered prototype. That's all I expected out of that $20,000. Yeah. Well, 6 months later, I got a call from Roy, and he says, come down and get your camera. Be right there. I took off to Pasadena, 168 miles away. And we sat there, and the boss is there again that owns the place. He inherited it from his father, and he wasn't too interested in it, except that it made him very wealthy. And he bought a lot of land up at Salton Sea area in the desert, and he put down $1 million at that time if he hooked into the water supply. So he was developing this land. If he hooked into it and didn't foul it up, they gave him his $1 million back. But if he broke it, they kept his $1 million. Yeah. That was what he was interested in.
Yeah, well.
We sat there and they discussed it. Apparently they had not discussed. They discussed the price of it there, me sitting there at the table. Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And finally he says, $8,000. I said, I'll take 3. I had 20,000. It ended up as a thing about this, made round like this, and about this thick, and painted white, and it was a ribbon frame camera. He even had to do some inventing, you might say, of methods, because you take ordinary aluminum and make pull-down claws, and to hold it in place like this, it would cut it in two like taking a hacksaw, the film did. So he had to learn to hard chrome aluminum and then hone this down by hand to have it to work. Well, I could do no wrong after that, sir. Well. And they decided to make me a section chief.
Okay, so you got a wonderful background in technical photography there.
Missiles that the Navy had while I was in the Navy, from the aircraft, the little ones, the small ones, and everything. The rockets, they had extrusion presses, and all of these things.
Well, eventually you got to Huntsville. How did that happen?
Well, my mother was dying with cancer, and I went back to school one summer in '53. to Houston and took a couple of advanced physics courses. And after I finished that up, the 6 weeks, I went to Birmingham and found that my mother had incurable cancer. And so went back, and my wife and I talked about it, and I didn't want to leave. I wanted to stay there. I liked it. I thought today I'd be living in San Diego or Pasadena. And I didn't want to leave. I wanted to stay there. And the day I started to leave, a friend of mine from North Carolina, a school teacher, I thought I eventually would get in his group. He was in charge of all the test conductors. I thought maybe in 4 or 5 years I'd get in his group. He called me in and said, he said, I want to go to lunch with you. I heard you're leaving. I said, that's right. He said, well, Commander Epple is leaving, and I wanted to offer you his job. I wanted to sit down and cry, because I thought it'd take 4 or 5 years to get into that, and here I'm offered on a platter. I'm already packed. We already had transportation. Already had the job in Huntsville that I had applied. The only job they would offer me was the chief of the photographic laboratory branch. And that's all I was offered, so when I put in an application, so I decided to take it. And so we drove across the country. We had 2 babies by that time. One was 30 months old and one was 4 months old. We vacationed all the way across the country. There were no problem at all. Not nearly as much problem as there were when they got to be 5 and 7 years old. And we ended up in Huntsville.
Okay, what year was it you arrived in Huntsville?
1954, day after Memorial Day.
Now, as director of the photo lab.
Yes, sir. And it was very inadequate photo labs compared to what I've been used to. The Navy seemed to have the best of everything, and the Army had antiquated equipment. And they had no air conditioning. You cannot process color film right without air conditioning. The only air conditioning on the post was in guidance and control lab, where they were doing that work, and the General Toptoy's office. And it was a window unit. So things were not nearly as nice, and we were in an old warehouse down by the railroad tracks. But we made the most of it, and
well, those were the days, if I understand correctly, when Von Braun was in a selling mode, and he was making lots of use of the photo lab to support his selling. And you might want to talk about that a little.
Well, we did. I wish I had kept the picture that I had at that time of the base on the base gates for sale sign.
We have a copy of that somewhere.
You do have a copy of that, good. And Von Braun, he was easy to talk to. I got to know Dr. Stullinger, who was the laboratory, the research projects later in the laboratory, and before that he was heading to Washington a lot, and I'd deliver all kinds of material to the airplane, to the airport for them to take to Washington when they were trying to sell the program. It was an exciting time, a lot of things going on, and then one day after things got I got things running like halfway decently, a private walked into my office. Said, "My name's Chuck Lundquist." Yes, have a seat. And so we sat there and talked, and he had something he was working on. Wanted to know if I could give him my hand. I said, "I think I could help a little bit. I've had similar situations when I worked for the Navy." So we started working together. That was the most interesting thing I'd had to do since I came here. Otherwise, I was repeating things I'd done before. And we started working together. I guess we worked together for about a year. And I found out that he was a PhD physicist. I didn't know. He didn't say anything of that sort. I saw his name on the door over at Athens College, Dr. C.A. Lundquist. I asked him about it later. And then I get a call one day saying, "I have decided to stay here. I'm out of the Army, and I'm in a new organization that Dr. Stuing has set up and called Research Projects Office. And he said, you need to help me get some people. Well, naturally, I said, I've got you one. He said, well, I'll be over to see you. I said, wait a minute, Chuck, where are you? I'll be over to see you. We interviewed, and finally, after working through personnel and everything, we worked together. Then I went to work for Dr. Lundquist and Dr. Stuing. Now, Dr. Lundquist wasn't there the first day, or the first few days. He was on a trip. And I'm in this room, and there's only one other person in there with me. And Dr. Stuing comes in, and he throws a report about 1.25 inches thickness on my desk, says, Americanize it, and walked out. And I thought, sir, if you think I can do that, I'll do it. I didn't have to understand the science. All I had to do is get the grammar in, is what he was meaning to do. And I did that. And I think I did it a couple of times, and finally we got a technical editor, which was really nice. And the group grew to quite a few people. And we did a lot of interesting work. It was just a high point of my life.
Well, somewhere down the line, of course, NASA was formed.
In 1960.
And you transferred over with everybody else.
Yes, sir. I asked, what if we don't want to transfer? And they said, out the gate. I said, I just wanted to know. I want to transfer.
Well, during those early days, one of the things I remember you were involved in was the observations of the reentry tests from ships down in the Atlantic.
That was a high point. It seems that Dr. Stuing, while Chuck was still away, came in and said, handed me a piece of paper. He'd been invited to a symposium at the Naval Ordnance Test Station in California, where I had left a few years before. And he said, would you attend this meeting for me? Yes, sir. Be happy to. And I got to see old friends and everything, and I attended this meeting. It was on infrared radiation. Well, I spent the next few days in the library reading everything I could on infrared radiation. And then I went to the meeting, and it was quite interesting. I met some people there from Barnes Engineering Company up in Connecticut. And one of the guys I started talking to, we had lunch together, and I said, how can we utilize this in our program of tracking these reentries? And we talked back and forth for the few days I was there, and I had half a dozen notes that I'd written down, and came back and talked to Dr. Lundquist about it. And he said, hey, I like this. Let's go see Ernst. I said, wait a minute, let me polish it a little bit. So then we went in and gave it the same pitch to Dr. Stuing. He said, let's go see Von Braun. I said, wait a minute, let me work on this some more. Well, in no time, I hadn't been in there just a matter of weeks when I made a presentation to Dr. Von Braun. And he said, hey, take it to headquarters and see if you can get some money. And so Chuck and I really sat down and tried to really come up with a program, and ended up with something that people seemed to like. An interesting situation. Chuck wore these, what do you call those shirts you wear outside that the South Americans?
Yeah, okay.
He wore that without a tie. Well, I always wore a tie and a jacket. Well, one day I started to work, and Dottie said, where are you going, Sloppy? I had no tie on and no jacket. I said, well, boss doesn't do it. I don't have to either. I got to work, and she said, well, goodbye, Sloppy. Have a good day, Sloppy. And I got to work, and at 30 I got a call from Von Braun saying, be in my office at 9 o'clock, give a presentation to me and the General, Medeiros, on gaslight. Well, I had nothing I could do but go. And I called Dottie in the meantime when I got back, and he said, now, after we did it, we talked for a few minutes, and he said, I want you to give the same presentation to the Secretary of the Army this afternoon at 2 o'clock. Yes, sir. Well, I called my wife and said, please bring me a jacket and a tie. And she just laughed. She didn't say anything. She just laughed. I never went to work without, at least it was there from then on. And I gave a presentation, and even the Secretary of the Army seemed to enjoy a little diversion of this sort. And from there, we were able. I didn't tell people what my grade was. I'm sure that I would have not gotten the kind of accommodation that I did, but I called the Navy and asked them, could I have a ship? And they wondered what I wanted to do, and I told them. And they said, well, okay, you can go out on this, just to try out equipment and all, you go on this destroyer in the South Atlantic. Okay, went aboard the Stickle, spent a week on board. And but it's like a cigar on top of water. It is not. No matter how steady the water is, it's like a cigar bobbing up and down. It does not cut the water. So then I called the Navy and asked them, could I have a carrier? Well, what do you want with a carrier? I told them, no, we can't let you have a carrier, but we can let you have a tanker. It might be even better. It's full of diesel fuel and other fuel, all, and it'll give you a good platform. Well, I got the carrier. They said, okay. And then I called the Army. This guy here just was a guy that let you do what you could do. He didn't tell you couldn't do this or couldn't do that. He changed later, but not by him. I called the Air Force and asked them, could I have their B-47 aircraft? And they said, what for? And I told them, wanted them to be over the launching. They said, all right, we can let you have one if you have somebody that's checked out on flying in one that would be with us. Oh, I got just the guy. And we had a colonel that was retired from it. He'd been a flyer. So he was tickled to death to get that. So we had him over the launching, and we were downrange with the gaslight. We called it gaslight. And we were fortunate to get 10 out of 14 tries, some success of tracking reentry bodies. And interestingly enough, the Air Force had a much larger program with many millions of dollars in it. We didn't have any instrumentation. I had been a member of an optical systems working group when I worked for the Navy, and they allowed us to work with all ranges, other people, the personnel, without having to go through commands of the base. And I still kept my membership in that, and I knew who had what kind of equipment in every range in the United States. So we invited people from all the ranges that had the right kind of equipment. We had 16 people, including me, aboard the tanker for 6 weeks. And they put it wherever we wanted it. Interestingly enough, first time we went out under one, the captain says, where do you think that thing will come in? I said, we want to position the ship so that it'll come right down the smokestack. Well, he turned white, and I didn't know why. But I found out later he was on the USS Franklin. That was the first Navy ship that went out during World War II that was completely loaded with solid propellant rockets, and all it needed is a spark. And the Japanese must have gotten wind because they had a kamikaze that came right down the smokestack, and he lost all but 3 members of his wing. He was a wing commander, and he lost all but 3 members of it. So that's why he had such a feeling as he did. I didn't know that at the time.
Well, you got some very unique data.
Well, we got enough to show that what could be done, and the Army then outfitted an old Victory ship and put a lot of ballast in it. And even after I was working for NASA, I was invited, and the NASA let me go on a cruise, their shakedown cruise, and they had some wheels from Washington on board too. and I got to sit in and act like a VIP on board the ship. And it was head of it was a retired admiral. He offered me a job on board, twice my salary that I was making. I talked it over with my wife, and she put thumbs down on that real quick like. But that was the end of that program for me. But it was a real interesting experience.
Well, then lots of other things happened in the space sciences world. Skylab came along.
That was a bright spot.
And, of course, the early satellites. You were involved in parts of that. But maybe we should jump forward to Skylab.
Well, Skylab, I guess, was real interesting. In fact, they used film. Actually had to go up and change film in the cameras. That amazed me, but they wanted to know what would happen to the film, so we flew quite a few different emulsions before that in order to see what the effect it would have on the films. And then they selected the particular films to use on the different cameras. And one time later, they were going to photograph Kahootek. Well, in those days, are not like it turned out later. Chuck and I spent more than one night in the comp lab with the computer, with nobody else around but us. Now, by the time they turned it over to contractors, you had to go to a window and turn your film in or whatever you're going to do, or you work in, and they did it and you hand it back to you. But in the early days, I was able to go into the Apollo capsule, lie down with an astronaut in there, and try to decide where can we put a camera, a 35 millimeter Nikon. And we talked about it, and I said, "Hey, what's that arm up there for?" He said, "That's for looking out the window at an angle, and it had different angles. You could move this arm, and it was about the size. It was a mirror." And I said, "Do you use it?" He says, "No, we don't use it." I said, "Let's get some Velcro and put a camera on it." He said, "Good, no problem." And that's how we got pictures of Kahootek. You could talk to the astronauts. Later, you could not. You'd have to go through so many people, and you'd get a no at the lowest levels.
Well, during the Skylab, I think you ended up in Houston being the troubleshooter for a whole battery of people from the lab who were down there.
Well, we spent 3 months down there. I had never been a bachelor in my life, and I even called my wife one time and asked her how to bake a potato. But we had meetings we'd have meetings at 11 o'clock at night and plan for the next day every night, and the group would get together and talk about what happened that day and arrange for everything that everybody had to do the next day.
This was supporting all the science experiments on Skylab.
And Skylab was one of the big science things that we did.
Well, after Skylab, what happened in your career?
Well, I was trying to do something that was beyond me and beyond anyone else. I was trying to connect telescopes with television to see farther than the telescopes ordinarily could see. And I got acquainted with Alan Hynek, who's head of the astronomy department at Northwestern University, and got to know the guy that set up the
Henneis.
Yeah, Carl Henneis, by that time had become an astronaut. He was the oldest astronaut at that time that they'd ever had. I asked him one day in the hall, I said, "I didn't think astronauts could wear glasses. He pulled them off, put them in his pocket." He said, "They don't." And But those two people were very interesting people to work with, and I made many trips up to Northwestern and also down. And also during this time, I was allowed, I got acquainted with Nancy Roman, who was in charge of astronomy programs for NASA. And I was able to get seed money. Well, I think it started out, I got seed money because they saw those fireflies somebody did in the early launches of the people in space.
The early satellites. Yeah.
Well, they wanted to know what they were. Well, I didn't know, and so I started asking around and finally found that in Boulder, some people had done some work, and I went out to Boulder and got a small study and decided it was coming from materials. So I took Jim Dozier with me. We went over and talked to the materials people, and I was told that no, we don't have time for that. Spent about a half an hour trying to convince them to take the job. And I finally, the only way I got them to take the job was, okay, I'm not a materials person, but I can go find one, and I will get a contractor to do your job. Oh, wait a minute. So they took on the program, that part of it, from that point on. But we did have set up under Nancy Roman, she let me have money enough, we set up an observatory in New Mexico in the mountains. And for, I guess, 2 years, it was run on a full-time basis, and this was an interesting situation for me. I can't stay awake at night. I could never be an astronomer, but I did spend several nights there over the period of 2 years, and we did get some interesting information. And I guess I gave a paper while you were still there in London. University of London. Also, it was interesting there that one of the people that was working on his PhD tried his best to get me to stay there and work on my PhD in London. I think my wife would have put a no on that one too. Said she didn't have two daughters for her to raise by herself.
Yeah. Well, in summary of this series of things, you were sort of the photography consultant for the organization from the very beginning till the time you retired. Yeah.
That put me instead into an area that was very interesting to me, and I loved working in it, and still have it as a hobby. I ended up as Dr. Lundquist left, I ended up as the deputy. I was his deputy, the division chief. And finally, I ended up, when Dr. Stuhlinger was moved into a level and George Booker, his assistant, I ended up with George Booker's job as assistant director under
yeah.
who got killed in an auto accident.
Yeah, under Heller. Gerhardt Heller.
Heller.
Yeah, Gerhardt.
And I asked him, he had two jobs. He wore two hats. He was the deputy director of the lab, and he's also a division chief. And he and I had fought over the table, over the years, over resources, not personal, always resources. And I would ask him, which hat do you have on, Gerhardt? If you've got the deputy director's hat on, I'll shut up. If not, I'm going to sit here and slug it out with you. And we'd laugh about it. And then when he got to be the director, he asked me would I go to the front office with him? I said, is this your way to get me out of your hair? He says, try me. I said, all right. And I've never worked with anybody that I was any closer to and worked as well as I did with him. And it was a real loss when he got killed in an auto accident. And at that time, I was asked what I felt about it by the the director of S&E. And I said, well, I fight fires daily. That's my job. And I said, I can't do any planning, and then you can't do two jobs. You cannot fight fires, and you cannot and do any planning. And if you go more than 90 days without us a director, I'm going to yell uncle. He said, Dad, you don't understand what I'm saying? Yeah, I understand. So in a week or so, I happened to think. I said, I got an appointment with him, and I said, you've got a man that's eminently qualified for this job as lab director. And he said, who? I said, Dr. Hauser. Hell no. And we were actually standing up at the table, on each side of the table, yelling at each other. And I'm yelling at my boss, my big boss.
Who was that then? Kingsbury, or
Huh?
was it Kingsbury?
No, this was Widener.
Oh, Herman Widener. All right.
Widener.
All right.
And he was like a drill sergeant.
Yeah.
He was a bull boy,
Yeah.
a big guy. But we were yelling at each other across the table. And I convinced him to let him, Walter Hausman, I said, you put him in the corner up here. And I said, he had the largest organization in the whole of any lab. And so he let him come down, and Walter told me that, he even tells me today, that was the happiest 6 months of his working life that he ever had was in our lab. And then Widener asked me, do you know anybody that you think we could get, because he's not going to stay. We can't let him stay. And I said, well, I know somebody, but I don't know whether he's interested or not. I said, he seems to be very happy up in Boston. Well, that was Chuck Lundquist. Well, not often you get a chance to hire your boss. So here I'm working for Chuck again, and happy to see him back there in the lab. And we had a good working relationship, and then he leaves and comes out from the university, and I decided it's about time to retire.
So when did you retire?
In 1983, and went to work for a small aerospace company that had been one of the wheels in another lab, and worked there for 6.5 years, and then worked for Dr. Lundquist 2 summers at the university. And by then my wife had gone blind, completely blind, and have a full-time job.
Well, this has been an interesting conversation, Ray, and I appreciate your coming in and doing this. Are there any final thoughts you'd like to leave for